go over here. One is on the dying of the American dream, and the second is on how the American dream is going abroad, we will say, and then we can get to that in a second. So the first article, Americans think the American dream is dying. Americans are increasingly skeptical of the idea that those who work hard will get ahead, and that is borne out in the scientific evidence in terms of social mobility. The United States is not a top country of the industrialized world when it comes to if you work hard, if you're competent, will you get ahead or not? That is not the United States. So the American dream is a media and entertainment fiction in the United States. It is not a reality. The United States is not competitive in terms of social mobility with other industrialized nations. So the article goes on to say Americans are increasingly unlikely to believe that those who work hard will get ahead and that their children will be better off than they are. Okay, so these are two separate things, but they're both really, really, really important. One is, are you going to be able to get ahead from working hard? Two is the country getting better such that future generations are going to be better off? And I really cannot think of a better indicator than that latter part for if a government is doing a good job. Okay? This is why it's something like 80-90% of Americans right now despise the Chinese government. And I do not get it. I truly, genuinely do not get it. Americans are living in a situation where their government is self-evidently responsible for the decline of their country. And yet Americans are criticizing the Chinese when something like 90% of Chinese people are satisfied with the government and believe that their children will be better off than themselves. And so things are getting better in China. The Chinese government is successful at its most fundamental objectives. The United States is not successful at its most fundamental objectives. And yet, for some reason, the propaganda apparatus has been able to persuade upwards of 9 in 10 Americans to think the Chinese government is worse. I'm not saying the Chinese government is perfect. There are a lot of things that I think they've done wrong. Just to name a few, just to show that I'm not particularly partisan, I do think they kept the one-child policy a little too long. As someone who thinks that demographics are destiny, I think that they messed with their population growth too much. Now, the idea of the one-child policy actually made sense initially because their population was booming to such an extent that Mao Zedong and other leaders of China were not able to properly manage the population, properly help out the population because it was just ballooning too quickly to be a manageable situation. And so the one-child policy did make a decent amount of sense. I think I would have kept it at a two-child policy because it's easier to reverse. But at the end of the day, what their policy did was it did slow down the population growth enough that they could get the situation under control. So I don't know how critical I can really be of that initially, but I do think they kept it a little bit too long. Another thing would be the COVID lockdowns, which I think they kept a little bit too long, but from everything they've said, it does sound like they might have some evidence that the COVID pandemic was created. They believe the COVID pandemic, this channel does not believe it because you're not allowed to say this on YouTube, but it sounds like the Chinese government believes that the COVID pandemic was intentionally created or it was a part of a process to create bioweapons that will target specific demographics. I believe it was based off of the AAC2 receptor. I can't remember off the top of my head. It has been a few years, but there are certain demographics that were more susceptible to it. And the Chinese thought that this was a bioweapon that was meant to be targeting them. It might have gone loose a little bit too early, things like that. So for them, the zero COVID policy did make sense. And I think they were too cautious, but that's just looking at the kind of rear view mirror, hindsight is 2020 type of thing. That they thought this was a bioweapon and so they lock down a little bit too long. But the thing is, their country is doing better. That's the sum of it. Okay. Overall, their people are more satisfied. Objective measures show that China is just growing at a far more rapid rate than the United States. And the United States, all of its growth comes from cannibalizing its own allies. Japan, Germany, just the entire Western world. It just goes about cannibalizing. It's even trying to do that with Taiwan and Taiwan's semiconductor industry right now. And it did that with South Korea's semiconductor industry. I was just reading about how South Korea used to have export superiority with China. They were exporting a lot of goods to China, and now they're not because of the United States and its semiconductor war on China. And so the United States is cannibalizing its allies right now. And so it makes no sense to me that a United States that is cannibalizing its allies and still not doing better than China, why Americans would be critical of China in that type of scenario, because China is just definitively doing a better job. And yes, the Chinese government is definitively doing a better job. These are by all objective measures. There is no argument to the contrary. It is flat out a matter of, if you disagree with me, you're wrong. Okay, so Americans, wow, I just spent almost 7 minutes talking about this one little paragraph. Okay, we might not get to the second article today. I will make that into a separate video. So why it matters? Why does it matter that Americans think the American dream is dying or is dead, and that their children will not be better off? Well, it leads them to conclude that the American project is not as successful as they originally thought it would be. And they have to start asking themselves, why are they a part of this American project if it's not successful, if things are declining? And that's what increasingly Americans are asking themselves. They're asking, why am I participating in this? Why am I contributing towards this with my tax dollars? Why am I calling myself an American? And Americans don't know anymore, because the most patriotic segment of Americans, I would say, it would probably be the straight white Christian demographic to a very large extent. And it's really weird, because everything that has to do with being American, every legal body, every institution is extremely hostile towards straight white Christians. And so for that population to consider themselves Americans, true Americans and patriotic Americans, does not make sense in the current environment, which is that the current environment does not like that segment of the population. You saw that with the January 6th situation, which I'm still very puzzled about. I've heard numerous people, back when I was an academic, I heard academics tell me that it was the worst terrorist attack since 9/11, and I was just very puzzled, because you have a few elderly, morbidly obese baby boomers who typically own more than their weight in guns, who brought no guns to the Capitol to protest an election that they thought was fraudulent. And I'm not saying it was fraudulent, but there were some indicators that things were suspect. But they did not bring any of their guns to the Capitol, despite having a ton of guns. And people considered that to be an insurrection. They called it an insurrection, despite the fact that the doors were literally opened for a lot of these people. They did not realize that they were committing a crime. And other people have entered the Capitol in protest before, and it has not been considered a crime or an insurrection. I believe even some has happened after, other protests have happened after at the Capitol that were pretty similar to what happened there. So it was a very confusing situation, but we see that clearly that segment of the population considers themselves to be the most patriotic, and yet they're the ones that the American government is hostile towards. So let's just move on. We're spending a little bit too much time on this. It goes on to say, driving the news, the Wall Street Journal asks respondents whether they believe the American dream, that if you work hard, you'll get ahead, still holds true. Just 36% said it does hold true. I would love to hear from that 36%. If you are one of the 36%, please tell me why you think that's the case. I bet it's the case that these people were the lucky few that did get ahead, and they thought it was because of their own merit instead of just kind of luck on their side. And I will flat out admit, I've had a lot of luck on my side. Sure, I've worked hard in life and I've been very successful because of it. If you've read my curriculum vitae on LinkedIn, you will know that. But I will tell you flat out that it was very clear the system was not meant to benefit merit. I just happened upon a few situations that would catapult me ahead in life, and then those situations accumulated. But it was hard work finding lucky situations. It was not necessarily hard work on its own that mattered. It was really the lucky situations. And without those lucky breaks, the hard work I do not think would have mattered anywhere near as much as it actually did in order to catapult me ahead in life. And so as someone who could have seen myself maybe as a part of that 36% here, I'm telling you, if you are a part of that 36%, that is just simply not true for the majority of people in the majority of circumstances, that hard work will actually get you ahead in life. I know people who were in worse circumstances, and they just, because of the cost of living expenses, they really couldn't get themselves ahead in life. There was no situation where they could have the extra time to put in the extra work to find the situations that would get them lucky to catapult them ahead. So it really is, there's no American dream. I'm sorry to tell you that. So moving on with this, just 36% said it does hold true that the American dream exists, versus 18% who said it never held true, and 45% who said it once held true but not anymore. Ooh, what do I think here? Okay, so obviously I do not believe the 36%, but of the other two categories, it's really difficult to say. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey towards my understanding about my lack of faith in the American system. And I was asking myself, why does the current American democracy not work? And I'm not going to get into too much detail, but what I will say is I looked through history and I'm like, okay, when did American democracy quit working? And I started looking at Lyndon Johnson and some of his corrupt acts. I believe, if I remember correctly, he was part of a sect of Christianity that was like really worshipful of people of Jewish descent, and he was a part of I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. He's a part of some voting machine apparatus, which was clearly illegal activity within Texas, and he helped them after he became president, and yeah, there was a ton of problems there. And then you look at the JFK situation where, let's be completely honest, that he was assassinated by elements that were within the American government, or at least the elements within the American government collaborated with foreign elements to commit that assassination. Again, seems like it was Jewish Americans that did that. If I remember correctly, it was a person of Jewish descent, I believe associated with the Jewish mafia, who assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald, who was supposedly the shooter of JFK. So there's a number of incidences that have occurred throughout history where I just kept going back. I kept going back, and I kept going back and saying, when did America work as a democracy? When did the American dream work? And pretty definitively, I came to the conclusion that it really never worked. It, at certain times, at certain points, it worked for some people. If you, again, were lucky, and I consider myself one of those lucky few in a lot of those situations. But for the most part, I would say I'm a part of the 18% who had the dawning realization that the American dream really, for the vast majority of Americans, never held true. Some of the time, for some of the people, it held true in some circumstances, but was not true anymore. Okay, so we see here the majority do not think the American dream is true. Compare that to surveys in 2012 and 2016, when 53% and 48% respectively said the American dream held true. Those polls were taken by different pollster with different methodology, but the downward trend is clear. Okay, so going from 53 to 48 to 36. So we can clearly see that America is on a decline, and there's no turning it around. This was something that I talked about too, and I thought about really over a decade ago at this point, where I was like, America is declining. What's the off-ramp? How do you turn this around? And I looked through a number of different ways of turning it around, And I came to the conclusion that there were none. All the off ramps to turn America around, to allow the American dream to occur, to make things better for future generations, all of those off ramps are in the rearview mirror. America is in terminal decline, which is something I talk about a lot on this channel. It is in terminal decline. And so we'll talk about this in another video, but that is why I would strongly recommend getting out of the United States, because it is not going to be successful in the upcoming future, which again, we'll talk about in a separate video, where people like myself are choosing to move abroad because that is where the American dream is now. Okay, so let's try to wrap up this article. So zoom in. Women were more pessimistic about the state of the American dream than men, according to the Wall Street Journal, while younger people were much more pessimistic than, this was supposed to be a short video made up of 2 articles, but I know I'm going to talk way too long about this topic. Okay, so modern America is made for women. Okay? Made for women, and for the most part, made by women at this point, because they hold so much sway in terms of voting bloc and in terms of pushing men in some situations to do things that women want. And so seeing that women are more pessimistic, given the fact that women have never held more sway in terms of the way of governing America, is, I don't even know what to say on it at that point, because it's like there's a complete decoupling in, I don't want to say all women's minds, but in quite a few women's minds, between what they explicitly say they want and what they actually want. Okay. And it has nothing to do with intelligence, because there's a lot of very intelligent women who say they want one thing and then they actually want a separate thing. And I think that's what's occurring on a nation state level here, which is women have pushed for certain things that they say they want, such as being in the workforce, and then they realize very late in life that they ruined the chances at what they actually want, which was having a husband, having a family, having children, obviously, is a part of that. And that's really what people have evolutionarily adapted for, particularly women, is to be in a nurturing state for others. So that's a part of the evolutionary adaptation that's occurred. And so you're seeing here that, and part of this is the propaganda apparatus of America. Media and entertainment has convinced women that they want other things. And you can see that that has not worked out. Women are the most overprescribed demographic of America. They're on a ton of anti-anxiety medication, antidepressants. They're the most pessimistic. And it's like, something's going wrong here. If women are making the decisions, if they are very persuasive in the American system, and they're the most unhappy with the current American system, that should tell you something about their ability to make okay, let me get into something here. There's something called tend and befriend, where women, because of their smaller physical stature, tend to focus on befriending people and nurturing or tending for others, because they need to get along with others, because they're not as physically threatening. They're not able to physically defend themselves as well. And because of that, the system they create tends to be based off of consensus instead of actual logical elements, because evolutionary adaptation tells them that the most persuasive argument, the most important thing to focus on, is the consensus of people. And if you have oligarchs in charge who are telling people that the consensus believes in certain topics, certain issues, then as a voting bloc, women tend to fall in line with those things because, again, evolutionarily, they've adapted to tending and befriending for others, and media and entertainment is telling them what they should tend and what they should befriend, how they should form a consensus with others. And so, sure, they've been manipulated, but they are the persuasive demographic. If they decided America could go in a different direction, America would absolutely go in a different direction, because women are in charge of America at this point to a very large extent. Maybe not the figureheads in some situations, but in terms of the policies that are being implemented, they are primarily endorsed by women, particularly well-educated women. So you got to look at this. You got to have some degree of introspection, some degree of reflection here about if women are as the most influential they've ever been in society, and women are more pessimistic than ever, what does that tell you? So I'm not going to go any more into detail about this. I know I'm already going to get flamed by feminists for the things I've already said. It also says that while younger people were much more pessimistic, we know from research that productivity and compensation has decoupled since the early 1970s. So old people are wrong. They're just wrong. The baby boomer generation, you are just wrong. Okay. If you work hard, you do not get paid more. We know this. It is objective reality. Younger people understand this because they are living that situation. But older people do not understand this because they are living in a world that does not exist. The world they grew up in, where you could get a living wage if you just make eye contact and have a firm handshake, that does not exist. That world does not exist. And older people have not grasped that reality yet. Okay, so it goes on to say, compared to the previous polls, the percentage of people who believe the American dream was never a reality more than doubled. Yeah, it's sad because the idea of the American dream, it's one of those fictitious situations you would love to see in a movie. It's really thrilling, but if you actually look at history, it's not true whatsoever. So over doubling means a lot of people are really opening their eyes to the fact that America is just not working and it's never worked. And so it goes on to say, yes, but in Axios Ipsos Latino poll last year found that 61% of Latinos believe that if they work hard, they can achieve the American dream. Okay, so I think there's a skewed perspective there because they're more recent immigrants in most cases, and I shouldn't say most cases, but in a lot of cases. So I think if you broke this down, the more recent immigrants would say, yeah, there's an American dream because of the fact that their home countries are being destabilized and destroyed, exploited, and their resources extracted by the American hegemonic empire. And so for them, the situation they came from was a very tragic situation, primarily caused by America and its proxies. And so for them, they see a better future in America, but they don't understand that better future came at the expense of their home countries. And so it sounds like an American dream. It seems like an American dream, but if you spend some time digging into it, it's actually based off of the sacrifices of the ancestors of Latinos to a very large extent because of the American domination of the entire Americas, both the North and South America. So reading between the lines, the article says, America's enormous wealth gap is often cited as a reason for the decline in faith in the American dream. A 2022 Brookings analysis suggests America is now less of a meritocracy than some other wealthy countries. Wealth inequality is high and wealth status is sticky, the author writes. So when it says wealth status is sticky, that means that if you're poor, it's really hard to have upward mobility, social mobility on that economic ladder. The article goes on to say, yes, but other scholars note that Americans over the generations have tended to be better off than their parents, another metric by which the American dream could be measured. Okay. So this is not telling you the full story. Yes, Americans over generations have tended to be better off than their parents. That stopped with the baby boomers. The baby boomers were the best off generation. And ever since then, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, all of these generations have been worse off than their ancestors. And I, as a millennial, I feel very sympathetic for the millennials because the data wasn't in on Gen X yet. I mean, they were still doing decently well enough that people thought, okay, you can still do really well in life if you just work hard and if you have an education. And so my generation, during the 2007-2008 financial crisis, we graduate high school, and instead of going into the workforce, because that wasn't really a real possibility, people told us, go on to higher education, because you can get a living wage. You can make something of yourself if you go into higher education. So we are the most educated generation in history, and it turns out that doesn't actually matter in a lot of cases. In fact, you go into a lot of debt because the baby boomers don't recognize that the cost of education is absolutely ballooned. So not only are you getting less for the degree, it's not as valuable anymore, but the cost of it is outrageous compared to what it was for the baby boomer generation. And again, I got very lucky with things like scholarships, grants, tuition waivers because of assistantships, all those things. I feel very blessed in that regard. But I know the vast majority of people were not in that situation. I had a lot of advantages, things like that, that a lot of it just did seem to be luck. So this metric, it's stopped. Okay, it's actually reversed, where people are worse off from generation to generation. So the article wraps up with what to watch. Americans are increasingly worried that trend won't hold going forward. In a recent NBC poll, a record low 90% of respondents said they were confident their children's generation would be better off than their own. So yeah, it's a really bad situation. So this was supposed to be a 2-minute read, and I spent over 26 minutes on it. So hopefully this was informative to you. I obviously am very passionate about this topic. It really gets into everything that we go over on this channel, which is the decline of what was supposed to be the sole superpower of the world and how we were supposed to be at the end of history, and truly we are not. History is entering a new cycle, as Ray Dalio would say in his book, The Changing World Order. And this new cycle is still up in the air about what it'll look like, but it does seem to be a kind of Russia and China dominated cycle of the world. So hopefully you found this to be informative. If you did, please give us a thumbs up. It does help us in the algorithm. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble for more content. Rumble's acting a little bit weird right now. It's not syncing my videos properly, so I do apologize about that. But if we do get permanently banned from YouTube, and I know we are being suppressed in the algorithm on YouTube, if we do get banned, we will transition to Rumble permanently. Please tell a friend about our channel. We are being suppressed, as I mentioned, and any help, any endorsement of our channel could be beneficial for opening up the eyes of more people. And that's the entire reason I'm doing what I'm doing, is because I think it's important that people, particularly the American Western audience, understands the situation that they're in, the grave situation that they're in. And this is my kind of advanced warning for what I think is going to be coming in the Western world going forward. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, critiques, please leave them in the comment box below. There was a recent video, at the time of this recording, that had a ton of engagement, a ton of people commenting. I'd love to see that again. And I do read all of them, and I do respond when it seems like it's necessary. So thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.